Welcome to the Housing Sector Podcast. Today, I am joined by Matt Lismore. Now, I'm going to say I curated this, but this is not true at all. By chance, I've had 5 podcasts: Dan Bruce, Jackie Begum, Giles Grover, Stephen Day, and today Matt Lismore. And we are all, including myself, housing activists. Yet none of us chose to become involved in this. It's taken a huge emotional, financial toil. And Matt, my first question to you today, whilst sort of providing a bit of background, is how on earth did you become involved in any of this?
Thanks, Ben. And thanks again for having me on. Like you say, involuntarily. I bought my first new build property in 2019 from a housing association. Thought nothing of it. It was on shared ownership tenure. The only way I could really get into the property market, even though I felt like I was in a pretty good job. And very soon after that, started to just realise that things weren't quite as they were advertised. So within sort of a year or two, myself and a number of other residents were highlighting quite serious building defects, namely around the balconies of our properties not seeming to be built correctly, but also some issues to do with service charge. And we could just never get an answer about anything or a justification for any of the increases in service charge. And being somebody who's not sort of prepared to be ripped off or taken advantage of in that way, I kept digging and digging and pushing for answers. And that eventually took me down this route of becoming somewhat of a housing activist and somebody that's really interested in the space. Because what I kept discovering, frankly, horrified me. I couldn't believe it to begin with, and now nothing surprises me. So eventually, the balconies that we'd identified as potentially not having been built correctly started to partially collapse on our estate within 2 or 3 years of construction, which definitely isn't what's meant to happen. And it was at that point that really I became quite heavily involved with media engagements around the building safety here. And I kind of, I suppose, took on that mantle for the residents here of being that person that spoke to the media and spoke up on our behalf, given that I was already chairing our residents association. And it kind of just spiraled from there. They found, after a BBC investigation, that illegal materials had been used by a subcontractor to build them. So rather than using timber, they'd used internal grade plywood. And also the metal they'd used wasn't galvanized, so it slowly rusted over time. So you had rotting, subpar wooden balconies with non-galvanized metal, and it comes as a surprise to nobody, I imagine, at this point, that they collapsed really quickly. I thought that was a really big issue, and actually the BBC were fantastic. That they put a lot of money up to do an investigation and found that all of the balconies of that type, over 77 of them, were at risk of imminent collapse. And that's kind of how I became so involved in this.
And presumably, you've got a domino effect. So if one collapses, it's going to fall down, and it's going to take all of the ones below it out as well.
Yeah, I mean, we were quite lucky in that, and I say that loosely because it could have been a lot worse. Nobody died here, and people could have died here. And that's why I say we were lucky. Also very lucky that the biggest partial collapse that we had was actually on a ground floor property, so that there was nothing for it to fall onto other than sort of the floor below. Equally, it was opposite a school. And if it hadn't have been, middle of the night on a weekend, there could have been children walking underneath that space, which doesn't really bear thinking about. But that is the seriousness of this issue. I think as well, what was really sad about the whole situation was that a number of people were going to the local authority, who were the freeholder, and being really vociferous in saying, these balconies are defective. We've already had a couple of partial collapses. You're telling us that they're safe, but we can see that they aren't. And nothing was being done about that. And I think that's one of the things I find most disappointing. I think any manufacturing and construction process can come with faults and mistakes. But when those mistakes are being flagged repeatedly and as loudly as people can, and it gets ignored, that's when I find it really inexcusable. And I maintain to this day that had it not been for the media coverage that this amassed, and my social media posts alone amassed nearly 1.5 million views at the time, I don't think it would have been dealt with. We had four collapses, partial collapses before this one in November 23, because there wasn't a big story about it. Nothing was done, um, and I think that is what frightens me, is that although it was clearly so apparent that this risk was there, nobody wanted to take action until they were browbeat into it by the media, and that isn't the right approach.
So look, I'm talking to you today. We had a call yesterday or the day before, and you seem like a
Mm,
perfectly reasonable fella. You're in a shared ownership, so you're a customer, you're a tenant. You've got half, your percentage of the building is yours. You're paying for. When
mm.
you first approached your housing provider, if we may take it back a bit, when you first approached them, what was their response?
Sadly, they actually didn't even respond. Um,
Hmm.
our property manager, I mean, our property manager actually became a bit of a joke around the estate, in that we paid for this person whose name is on all the notice boards. If you have any issues, contact this person. But nobody had ever heard from her. They would raise the issues and they wouldn't hear from her. And it became a running joke as to whether this person even existed. And at that point, I actually went to my local MP, who at the time was Dame Margaret Hodge. She was fantastic. She took us incredibly seriously. Her staff made loads of time for us to talk about this issue. And she actually wrote a letter to the council on our behalf, urging them to do something about these balconies. And they ignored her too. Um, and to me, that's negligence. If a member of parliament is writing to you
Mm.
about defective new build property in their constituency, you have a duty of care to do something about it. Um, it moved very much past the realms of, oh, whoops, I missed that in my inbox. It even got to the point where I was actually directly contacting the leader of the council, and the leading officers in that space, pretty much begging them to help us. But nothing was forthcoming. Um, and that meant it was preventable. If they'd listened to us to begin with, they could have remediated this issue before that really serious collapse in November.
Yeah.
And that is extremely disappointing. I think when you pay for a management service and you're unable, and this comes back to the whole leasehold thing, which is a whole different story, but we don't choose our property manager. We don't have the ability to choose our property manager. The freeholder, who in this case is the council, has a fiduciary duty to make sure that they are finding one that delivers for us. And they selected themselves. And when they did a bad job, they didn't replace themselves. And so it makes you feel powerless. I mean, a lot of people gave up. I know of many people who actually just moved, sold their properties and moved because that was easier than trying to get a straight answer, which, yeah, I mean, that says a lot in itself.
It certainly does. And, I always feel, I complain about my landlord, Green Square Accord, and, they're just, and they're completely middle ground. They're not one of the biggest, they're not one of the smallest. They had mergers, all the issues. But our homes are, I hope, to a certain extent, reasonably safe. And the people that I've been speaking to are living in unsafe homes, and I go to bed every night wondering if an
Mm,
e-scooter is going to catch fire and burn through the whole building. You've got the fear of balconies collapsing and the structural damage that will inevitably cause, and you're being
mm,
ignored. So you've got this first round where we've got a sector that says, oh no, we listen to the residents, we engage with the residents, the voice of the resident. We've got all of that narrative being pushed. But you're clearly being ignored, as are many of, and in fact, all five of the people who I've just claimed as reluctant heroes, all five have been
mm.
ignored. What was your next step?
really, I then took to the media. Um, I think it was at the point where the service charge was escalating for no apparent reason, and we couldn't get an invoice, we couldn't get any proof of any of the works being done. And it was at that point I started contacting, well, I was in contact with BBC Newsnight, started recording some content for them actually that was primarily focused around service charge and concerns being ignored. And during that period that we were filming stuff for Newsnight was actually when the balcony, that November 23 balcony, the last one, collapsed and everything went kind of viral from there. Um, and in that interim period, I'd actually set up a Twitter account to kind of directly just share what these experiences were. Because there were a few things. The first was I thought, we can't be the only ones. It can't just be happening here. And that became abundantly clear to me straight away was as soon as I created that Twitter account and started talking about the leasehold issues and the new build safety issues that I was having, it it resonated with far more people than it should. And it spoke to me about a wider problem, whether it's on cladding, just general poor build quality, like one of your other guests, Stan Bruce, or leasehold issues of not being able to get a straight answer about where your money's going. And that tied in very well with sort of when the balconies collapsed in terms of when I'd started doing that. And there was sort of a dual effect of my social media went quite viral for a short time after the collapses, but also we had some fantastic coverage with the media. And since that happened, I went from being somebody who was shouting into the abyss about a potential defect to a home to being one of the people, who are actually a canary in the coal mine. It was no longer tenable to try and dismiss people like me in this estate as people that are just making up, hysteria for no apparent reason. We were proven to be correct. And so that meant that the media were far more willing to engage with us. And we've been able to hold the council to account for so many different things via the media since then, but also via social media. And there's probably been around a dozen different things that have made the national or local media about the situation that Barking and Dagenham Council have created here off the back of that campaigning and that advocacy that I've been, as you said at the beginning, forced into undertaking. I don't want to be doing this. I've got plenty of other things to do. But it's just been almost brought out of me by my unwavering view that social justice matters, and treating people with respect and decency really do matter. So that's sort of how it's evolved.
And look, I don't want to in any way glorify what we're doing because it's a necessary thing, and we've not chosen to do this. Do you find though that there are times when the emotional toil and the fact of my wife likes to say, we're not asking for the moon on a stick, we're just asking you to do the service that we're paying for.
Mm.
And yet it's met with such resistance from a sector that claims to be open, transparent, honest. Where's this disconnect coming from? Do you think they can't afford to fix the problems? Do you think they don't want to fix them, which seems unbelievable that they would leave tenants in an unsafe home? Do you
Mm.
just think there's too many talking heads and not enough ability to make the course correction that's needed?
I'm I think about this a lot because I tend to try and see the best in people and try and assume positive intent. And I can't, especially in our situation where it's a local authority, I find it really difficult to think that anybody would go into working there that isn't interested in public service. However, my experience tells me that we are seen as people who should just be grateful for whatever it is they end up getting.
That's
And
exactly it. That's the yeah.
that isn't right. I paid quite a premium to purchase a home that should have been built to a reasonable standard. And being unwavering in pursuing ensuring that it is remediated to that standard doesn't make me unreasonable. And I think there are a number of things that I've realized through this process that kind of feed into that. I think, you're right. Obviously, some people say that it is, it's this heroic journey that you go on as well to sort of do all this advocacy. But you might feel the same. I don't know. Mine was born out of self-interest. It progressed into something else, but ultimately I was advocating for me to begin with, and then it became advocating for other people as well. So there is a massive element of self-interest in it. I think the actual the actual problems are so much broader than just one thing. I don't think it's a univariate issue. I think that it's so multifaceted. The first, I would say, in my circumstances, a skills gap, but also a funding gap for local authorities. I think, my local authority don't have the skills to be a landlord. They
Yeah.
just don't. They don't understand the seriousness of the challenge that they face. They don't understand the importance of the decisions that they make. And that leads them to deliver pretty poor outcomes. But I also think a lot of the people that they put in positions of responsibility for us on our behalf are just not up to the task. A property manager told that the balconies were structurally unsafe by a number of tenants that was competent wouldn't have ignored it. Because if they were competent and cared about their job, they wouldn't have been able to sleep at night thinking about what could happen. So to me, there's a competence issue at the core of it. Over time, though, I've come to view local authorities as so under the cosh financially that they'll do whatever they can to make ends meet. And I think that's led to leaseholders and social housing tenants that are looked after by the council just being totally let down. And I think at the officer level, and obviously, I've had a lot of conversations with council officers about the challenges here at Weavers Quarter and other estates. They don't view it as a human social value issue anymore. It's a financial book balancing exercise. That isn't what they are there to do. They aren't a business. They're there to provide social value. And if they aren't focused on the social value element and they're focused on the financial element, they're going to make decisions that are based on fulfilling those financial KPIs. And that is centered around things like reducing the repair bill, reducing the cost of maintaining the place, cutting back on safety checks, whatever it might be. It leads to bad outcomes for residents. If you cut corners on repairs this year, you'll pay twice as much next year. If you don't fix the damp properly today, it comes back worse next year. All of these things, any competent council officer would know, they don't really save money. They cost you more in the long term. And so I do find it difficult to say that it is just one thing. But equally, when I look at the broader picture, and I've come to know so many people who, whether they've bought a luxury apartment, whether they've bought a middle of the road standard family home, social housing, council housing, private rental, the housing market in this country is just annihilated. To say it's broken is an understatement. It's just been obliterated beyond recognition. And I say that because there's people buying luxury apartments that aren't fit to live in from day one. There are people being placed in a one-bedroom home with damp and mold for a family of five. Any functioning society wouldn't have housing issues that are prevalent across the both ends of socioeconomic distribution. And I just think that a lot of people shy away from the truth of how hard it will be to fix all of these issues. There's a lot of papering over the cracks, and there's a lot of lip service paid to people in situations like yours and mine and other guests that you've had. But in many respects, a lack of seriousness in trying to find a solution. And I think those things packaged together are how we ended up in a situation like this, I suppose.
I think you're right. I mean, I had a conversation with Paul Kershaw in the podcast Follow the Money, and we very much made a link that, with the social enterprises, now the CEOs, they're all former finance directors. So finance directors have moved into the senior leadership role within the housing associations. And it has
Mm,
become sort of bottom line profit driven. This is what we need to do. And you're absolutely right about, the cost. It's not cost effective. But by the time, you cover over the damp and mold today, 18 months, it's a bigger problem. But by that time, they're already down the road. They're already, it's someone else's
mm,
problem. And I think the country, it's got, its biggest commodity is mediocrity, is Thames Water, it's the national health. We've got all the post office scandal was another one. We've got all these things that we all know are wrong, and we just hope they don't come to the surface. You've been really lucky with your media attention because I found the local media, well, they got bullied by my landlord into not publishing stories, and that's well documented in the Slaps
mm.
case. But it sounds like they were quite receptive to you.
Initially, they probably weren't. I mean, I suppose I had Joe Pike and Guy Lynn to thank for a lot of it, both at the BBC. Joe obviously got us some really comprehensive coverage of the service charge element on BBC Newsnight, and that just put it out there for all to see. Barking and Dagenham Council rip off leaseholders. Just categorically, there are the numbers. It is a rip off. He was brilliant. And then equally, Guy Lynn and his team at BBC London, I was very fortunate that when they came to discuss the balcony issue, I'd actually kept some of the material that had fallen and kept it to one side. And when they initially approached me, I did say, look, I've actually got some of the stuff that fell down. Can you use that? And that was when it became possible that they were able to do a bit more, where they were basically able to do their own independent research into whether or not the materials used met the legal requirement. Um, and they were fantastic. And I think from there, it almost snowballed onwards. I've had the fortune of not only having some great media coverage, but also some really great housing campaigners sort of giving me a platform. I think you're probably familiar with Free Leaseholders, Harry Scoffin's founded group, and they were the first people to actually show any interest in talking to us about anything. He's been really supportive in amplifying the message around, especially the service charge and the leasehold issues here. Because I think a lot of people think that it's this London elite issue of these fancy Kensington apartments with a 24-hour concierge paying through the nose for service charge. Our situation was very different. It's a no frills, mid-rise, council freehold block. And his advocacy was really helpful. But also Kwejo Twenoboa has been really great. He actually is the first major, sort of housing activist that reposted the stuff to do with the balcony collapses. And after that happened, it kind of went viral from there. I think them lending their platforms to me at that time helped journalists maybe feel a bit more comfortable to speak to me, perhaps. I don't know. But it did feel like after that, there was so much more trust in me when I went to journalists with things. Which is a shame because it shouldn't take that level of scandal to become somebody that journalists go, right, actually, we can give this person the time of day. But I've been really fortunate to find that a lot of journalists have given me that time. I also think it takes a lot of work to prepare all of the documentation you need to get something to the threshold that it can be published. And being someone that is so driven and detail oriented like I am about this, I've got records of everything. And I think that also really helped. But I think that the media do seem to have switched in terms of their views of housing, and there seems to be widespread recognition that actually they do have a crucial role to play in highlighting this, this what is now a national crisis. And I certainly feel like in the last year or so, the major media companies have started really putting more out there and putting people's stories across. But maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm looking for it.
That kind of underlines the point you made earlier. You know, had you reported your balconies weren't safe and they'd come around, they'd shoved up some scaffolding, they'd started remedial work on it, there wouldn't have been the collapse, there wouldn't have been the activist support, and it wouldn't have been newsworthy. It would have just been something that was a
Mm.
mistake and was fixed early on. You would have carried on with your life. They would have had homes that were safe. They wouldn't have all this negative publicity. So that's exactly the sort of the issues that we need to avoid, isn't it? Fix it when it's wrong, when you know it's been brought to your attention.
Well, yeah, definitely. And I think that goes right across the sector. I think, I'm currently in the process of moving house, and finding a house to buy in London is always a challenge. But we talk about, people doing the right thing before they're forced into it. And a lot of the properties that were on the market where I was looking were actually former buy to let properties. And, I spoke earlier about people just not delivering on what they're meant to do. All of these properties in these London boroughs now have landlord licensing schemes where the local authority comes along and says, oh, Mr. and Mrs. So and so, you've got a landlord license. We've attested that your property is up to these standards. And it normally says things around free of material risks, free of serious hazards to health, etc., etc. I could count on one hand the number of properties I saw that were buy to lets currently that were on the market that met that standard. The overwhelming majority of homes that I went to see when I was looking to buy were covered in damp, mold, they had leaks, they had, pestilence infestations, you name it, they were there. And I always, because I'm interested, I always used to ask if the tenants were actually at home. I'd say, "What? Is your landlord not doing anything about this?" And the stories were all the same. They said, "If you don't like it, you can move," etc., etc. And I did think, well, there is also this element of enforcement of standards in the same way that the building safety standards weren't followed on my new build property. The landlord licensing conditions that their landlords are meant to follow aren't being enforced properly. And then you look at the number of rulings that are being made, even against local authorities, around judgments and maladministration. They're not looking after their properties either. So all the way across the piece, whether it's the new build sector or private rental or local authority rent, everybody is cutting corners and not meeting their legal responsibilities. And I think until we change that, we can't fix the housing sector in this country because it's currently being ran at the mercy of some of the worst actors in society.
I say, and you know, when we'd all read about the post office scandal, we all knew it was happening, but
Mm,
it took that ITV drama to really, wake up the zeitgeist and everyone to go, well, that's really bad. We should be paying more attention to this. There hasn't been, and I can to a certain extent understand there hasn't been a sort of docudrama, if you like, about Grenfell. There hasn't been anything about the housing. Do you
mm.
think we need an ITV or a Netflix drama that's going to wake up everyone and suddenly people are going, yeah, this is a big problem. Why aren't we addressing this?
I definitely think we do. Um, I definitely think we do. The problem we suffer with in housing, especially in new build standards and leasehold, it really isn't the most dramatizable subject. It's quite hard to get people excited about it. It's really technical. It's really boring, and um, that that makes it harder to get it to that point where it could be a dramatization. But yeah, definitely something like that that can really put it into context for people, just how much of an impact this can have on your life. Um, yeah, I think that would bring it home for people for sure.
Yeah, well, maybe there's one in the pipeline. Samuel L. Jackson gets to play me if I ever get a part in it. Look, I started out completely self-serving. As far as I was concerned, this was our home. We had a financial investment in it, And we don't have children, so this would be our like end of life care. We would sell the property
Mm.
and hopefully travel around the world. Um, it could also be,
Sounds like
looking
a good
after us.
plan.
Yeah, or looking after us in old age, if God forbid we fall
Yeah.
into sickness and need care. So it was self-serving, and now it's become much bigger than anything I'd ever anticipated, and it's had a toll on me financially and personally. What has the toll been on you, Matt, as a person, and in your immediate relationships?
I suppose I'll split that into two. I mean, on my personal relationships, there was a point where felt like I could no longer be happy day to day. It was so all encompassing. I couldn't enjoy spending time with my partner, my friends, my family, because I was just in a constant state of anxiety about my home, about service charges, about building safety. And that probably lasted for over a year. Um, and that was just awful for me. It totally sideswiped me. Um, I think, like yourself, it was initially a self-serving thing. And then as I started to dig a little bit deeper and scratch underneath the surface, it became something that I'm incredibly passionate about. And I've always been a member of the Labour Party for many, many years. It became a motivating factor in me realising that at some point I want to stand for public office, because I don't think that we can fix, you know, the issues in our country, in our society, without fixing housing. I think it's at the root of everything, whether it's health, wealth, growth, prosperity, happiness. I think all of it is being severely restricted by housing. So I've become a lot more involved in the Labour Party. I'm a proud member of the Labour Housing Group, groups like Labour YIMBY, because I do believe that the only way out of the crisis that we're in, amongst other things, is to build more affordable, high quality homes for people. But at the same time, I will continue. I will always continue to be an advocate of leasehold abolition. For a start, home ownership has to actually be ownership. You don't buy a home to have a landlord. That's the most bizarre concept. To almost every other country in the world, they look at that and think that's really bizarre. So that's the first thing. And then I think that, the other things I'll continue to advocate for are, there should be no child in school homeless, but 1 in 20 children, apparently in London, are in temporary accommodation or homeless. We need to fix that. That's before you even get into how many children are in substandard accommodation with damp and mold that's causing them to develop conditions like asthma. So the lasting impact on me has been, it's given me a passion to try and contribute in any way that I can to addressing the housing crisis across the piece, whether it's from leasehold reform, standards, building more social housing. And hopefully, I say hopefully, fingers crossed, I did last week submit my application to the Labour Party to stand in the London 2026 council elections. So if all goes well, fingers crossed, I should hopefully be able to stand next year, although it's still very early stages. But that will be something that I continue to be passionate about. I think without a solid roof over your head, you can't ever be happy or ahead in life. And I think that has been the lasting impact on me. It's just made me appreciate so much more how important a stable home is.
Yeah, it's the cornerstone of any thriving society. I think, Matt, you've summed it up very well there. I think we'll end the podcast there on a sobering thought. I wish you all luck in your future endeavours, and we will stay in contact. And please come back on. Let's keep the conversation going. Maybe by having these difficult conversations that everyone seems to shy away from, and put a
Mm.
veneer of PR, we can get to the bottom and we can address it. Because you're absolutely right. Without a home, you can't thrive and you can't become a positive member of this society. Matt, thank you very much indeed for your time today. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks, Ben. Likewise. I'll speak to you soon.